Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's wonderful to be here. So tonight you've just got sort of us landscape architects and, and Larry Burrows, who's a forest ecologist who works in our team. So Leona de Ridder and Stefan Krabberger are landscape architects in our Lucas Associates team doing the integrated farm plans. And we've been doing these for a few years now. And it started with thinking about the difficulties we're in and how we're going to address our emissions, and me just wondering, could we look at farms and see, could we transition to carbon zero, and what might that involve? And so that's what we've done, because we're looking at the issues. So thinking about all these issues we're facing and the need to increase our resilience with climate change, the consequences of a whole lot of the climate change things with greater fire risk, and the need for addressing, invasiveness. And this is, we've been involved in Marlborough Sounds and all the wilding pines and invading there, and addressing those in landscape change. And the need to address landscape continuity, the means for which species to migrate with increased temperatures and so on, so that we need ecosystem continuity in our landscapes. And so thinking about all those things, and things like the changes that are happening that we're not necessarily too excited about, so the pines invading our grasslands, we're looking at managing change. When I set up practice in Geraldine in 1979, I was working for government, for Ministry of Works, various parts of New Zealand, and I didn't like what was happening, the government policy that was wrecking rural landscapes under Muldoon. So I resigned and thought I'd see if I could be on the outside and make a difference. And so I set up practice in Geraldine, because in those days farmers wouldn't necessarily want to have a consultant from town. They have a lot of those these days, but they didn't in 1979. And I immediately got asked to do farm plans. Farmers around various parts. It was great. And then I got asked to do a series of guidelines in the New Zealand Farmer Mag. They went, in 15 articles or something, through different issues of the New Zealand Farmer Mag, and the Federated Farmers and Farm Forestry and different groups got me to, do guides and help guide people on appropriate landscape change. Next. And, I did guides to woodlots, how to integrate forestry into the landscape, all that sort of stuff. So that was through the 80s. And then we've had a big change since then. There was everything through the 90s, and since then that sort of stuff hasn't happened. There's been a complete different emphasis, and there's been a very narrow approach really on a lot of things, just purely addressing sort of nutrients, or purely addressing freshwater quality, and not addressing sort of landscape change. So I was really thrilled to see these Ag Matters videos come out. Did people get them last week? What are they called? NZ Ag Research Centre in Palmerston North put out a series of 6 little videos of what individual farms were doing. Each video is a different farm, how they're addressing environmental quality really, including greenhouse gases. And it was really interesting to look at, and we went through them, but they're not, they're a start, and people are making a start, and some farmers are making a great start and trying to transition, and up to sort of 10% reduction in emissions, which was great. Next. But the thing, because the big thing is, just as those farmers are demonstrating, we need to get out of this sort of siloed approach, out of the just addressing a single feature and get into integrating. Because I get very distressed when people are just, you know, you fence off your waterway to plant it to address the nutrients and fresh water quality and sediment. But there's no thought of, could that also be a carbon offset? You know, it shouldn't just be carrots and flaxes and things. You need to be thinking, are there other ways you can be addressing that to get some woody cover and to be a carbon offset on a farm? So what we seek to do is recognise the diversity of New Zealand. I mean, I love it that New Zealand is this, what I call the land of little landscapes, that we have this really diverse country. You know, the earthquakes and the volcanoes and everything are throwing up lots of different stuff. And we've got marvellous diversity. And so one method that addresses that, one information system, are the ecological regions and districts. And that's a useful carve-up of New Zealand to set, that describes the nature of each district. Sadly, you know, it was done in the 80s, in the good old 80s, and it would be good to make it more accessible now, and perhaps we can try and do that to make it more active, that, you know, the descriptions come more easily and stuff. But it's a good system because we've not been good at providing integrated information systems. Next. But what we've done from when I went back to Lincoln because I was frustrated at the superficial landscape stuff that was happening around the country, and I went back and in the later 80s, and one of the methods I worked on was developing this land typing, which we've used ever since, and to understand the nature of the underlying nature of land at various scales as a guide to management. What's appropriate? How do you manage it? So what we've done is look at various scales, from big regional scales down to more paddock scale. Next. And so having approaches, so you get the big stuff right, windowing right down to in that. So a system that you can get your finer and finer information on. We generally work at 3 scales, the landscape type and the land type, which is what we've called them, and teasing down to landform components where you need that information. And the method uses that mapping, the spatial thing, but also a modelling and charts of information. Next. So the modelling, the type of countries in models, and charts which show the geology, the elevation, you know, the vegetation that belongs there naturally, and what sorts of land uses are typically appropriate there. So in Canterbury, we did it for the Canterbury Regional Council in 1993, and did the whole of Canterbury into the broad landscape types, and windowed down to the land types, both in the lowlands and in the high country. And for each, there's the modelling and charts of information for each one of those land types through Canterbury. So I remember using it back in the Hurunui years ago, and the different types of country in the Hurunui district. And there was, from the models and charts I used back there in 1995. Next. And then, so today, if we pulled out the land types in this area, in the Hurunui, they're now on, I'm pleased, in this last few months, they've gone on to Canterbury Maps, and they're on LIN's database. So the land type mapping is now online. They haven't got the models and the charts up yet, but we'll get that, won't we? So it's a start, and we've got one scale of the mapping up. So I think that's a good start. Next. So then this is back there. It show you, if you look at those different types of country, you all know the different, even the soft rock country, the difference from the hard rock country, completely different landscapes here, and land uses and vulnerabilities and opportunities. So recognising that in the typology. What we've just done is in Christchurch, because Christchurch sits there on these young outwash plains and then down to the coastal plains and the Port Hills land types. What we've just done a month ago, it's gone online in the City Council website, and we've got that detailed right down to a fine scale with the native plant lists for each part of the city. So you can put your address in, our Manchester Street, I can put in the address in, and it comes up with the plant list as native to our street. And so this is a leader, and when we did this originally in 1995, and now it's just gone online. Some good things take time, but it's it's exciting that it's happened at last. So that, and it's a leader that nowhere else can you get that sort of detail. When we did it in the 90s, it was a world leader to understand the nature in a city. Next. So getting into using this stuff, and in the integrated farm plan, what we did first was test back in my Tūranga Waiwai down in the Matao, the Clutha. So just on a little 40 hectare lot there to test, could we look at farm planning to transition to carbon zero? So again, the method, using the land typing to the different sorts of countries. This is the 40 hectare lot here, down to these floodplains, the different levels there. Next. And then looking at the what's on the farmland, the plantings, the water issues, the different issues and stuff that are there. So identifying those. And then here taking out with plantings, looking at how we could have increased woody plantings that would address the water issues and the different issues. We've got 3 scenarios. And then there's a plant-based one, so de-stocking it all entirely and having different plant-based production. And so then, Steph, if we move on to the figures, we've got the data there on the hectares of each land use, and then on the figures for the emissions. So this one, it shows in the current scenario the grazing with the cattle, mainly cattle and some sheep. So there's 269 tonnes of carbon per annum from this 40 hectare block under the current management. That's the emissions from this block. Under that conservative one that I flipped over because I didn't see enough change, is just still 248 emissions. So it doesn't even quite meet your 10% requirement under Zero Carbon Act, does it? If we go to that one with the swathes of planting through it, we get about carbon zero. So, and then with the plant-based one, we're in credit. We've got some carbon in the bank. So I thought it was really interesting when we did that, because it's a small block, and it was really interesting for teasing out the approach. And then we were able to test it against their overseer data and all that, so it was good. So this one's looking into coming to Canterbury now, into the Rakaya Gorge, and here in the Mount Hutt Ecological District, and above the high plains there, and looking at the land types there from the Canterbury database, the different land types across this farm. So we're both in the hills and onto that glacial fluvial country. So looking at the data for all of those, next, right down to paddock scale, mapped down to paddock scale with the land typing, the components on each of those. And then here we've got, including land use capability here, showing these, the class 3, 4, 6, and a wee bit class 7 around. And then looking at the current land use. Steph, do you want to describe these?
Yeah. So this map here is showing the current land management. So it's just broken down into units of how the land's used. But we try and do it in a way that encapsulates what's being underutilised too. So we recognise, say you look at a paddock and half of it's actually quite steep. Even we break it down into different types of use and potential use. So that's the property broken down, and then we have some options, a series of different options again. So explaining this one, so we did quite an extensive map of essentially proposed planting changes, and this is really complex, big property, like 1,500 hectares, so extensive property, and within that there was something like 1,500 land management units or more, so really nuanced. And then
because it goes from sort of mountainside right down into the riverbed, so, and it's very complex.
Yeah. And from that we found that with our juvenile plantings, it had a total emission is about 1 tonne per hectare, so it's 1,500 tonnes per year, and it's about 1,500 hectares at the moment. And so with our plantings at a juvenile stage, we dropped that to negative 462. And the interesting thing from the farmer's perspective as well is we could break it down into those different areas so they can prioritise that. It's probably not going to be all of them at once, but it's quite a useful tool in that sense. And then this is the break down the tables of those, and you can see it goes into mature plantings over there.
And then we've got another stage.
And that nearly drops it down to net zero. And then we've got a second stage, which is space trees and pasture, and that drops it to seriously negative. And then we have another stage, which is to transfer to cut and carry. So rather than, especially this is on the low flats, because it's got some seriously low flats that goes straight into the Rakaia. And so we're proposing to stop grazing on those.
Certain timelines been set by government in terms of Carbon Zero Act, but also the Climate Change Commission setting some thresholds and timeframes, so they'll all influence things as well. But this one, if we get down here even, this way exceeds any of the targets that have been set. This is showing, can get to a really good space.
But the time to actually start, as Larry probably would like to jump in here and say as well, the time to actually start being a sink, there's a period of time for the plants to actually grow until they actually get into that stage. And so we're planning for it, but the actual reality of where that gets to is going to take varying amounts of time depending on what type of plants it is. Yeah.
And this farm is like one of the ones in the Eggside new videos. This one, they've already done lots of good things. There's lots of plantings, there's lots of little pockets of shrubland and stuff, and there's a lot of woody cover on it, and that's why it comes out so well at only a tonne a hectare. You know, it's a very good one. So they've already, as with many farms in New Zealand, especially sheep and beef farms, you know, they've already done a good job to integrate some woody cover, and that helps hugely, especially if it's post-1990.
That site's as well got around quite 7 hectares of cherry, exotic cherry that's rampant on a big hillside. So part of the proposal is to transition that, because that's actually quite a good sink at the moment. So it brings out quite a few tactful things where you have to
But
keep
it's invasive.
and slowly transition. Yeah.
To phase out the cherries and
Yeah.
the sycamores.
Yeah, and bring it down underneath.
Bring
without-
another permanent forest cover.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll let you
Move on. So then High Plains Dairy one. We'll quickly go through that. So up in here in the High Plains, again using, that's the ecological regions and districts. That's the soils. Go through that. And here's the land typing. So this is the landscape type, and through to the land types, onto the High Plains lands, up there on the L3s. And then looking at the property in terms of the landform components on that farm. And this one is a 1,200 cow dairy farm, that's 700 hectares with pivot irrigators. And so we looked at the current emissions from 1,200 cows, and then looked at first the way we've staged it in the plan, but it's not necessarily how it gets implemented, but we've staged it first with plantings to get those underway. And it includes, under the pivot irrigators, we've got bands of woody food forests, food plantings. So under the pivot irrigators, you've got a 2.6 metre, 2.4, 2.6 metre high clearance under the pivots. So there's quite a lot of fruiting trees we can have under that height, and you can always put a hedge over them. And that these trees will sequester carbon, but also provide a food crop. These dairy farmers are very keen that every square metre is kind of producing food. And, I understand that. And so this isn't, going and planting pine block or anything. This is about using the land for food production. But one of the benefits is that the roots going down into that land, intercepting the nitrates that have been that are there from previous applications, and that's useful. Next, so we've got various planted regimes with tree crops that are grazed between. And then some bands, especially on like scarps, the terrace scarps, of planting them up with native plants or with tree crops. And then a second or another stage is for the cows to be in herd shelters, so that they're not, putting all the piss and shit on the land. And then there's a biodigester installed, and that can hugely reduce the emissions. So what we've got is shelters for the cows. The important thing is a place to collect the material, and then that goes to the biodigester, which produces a biofuel which can produce the algae, which can be fed back to the cows, and which can enable the production of all sorts of other products from what's produced from the biodigester. It's been a really interesting one. People realise that, it's been a bit of PR about it lately. I've been pleased to see that, the value of algae for cows, that, the reason cows go into your wetland and slurp up all the slimy water is because it settles their stomach, it reduces the methane, and they like that. And so sucking that up, that reduces the methane. So instead of them having to go into a wetland and do that, we produce the algae on site. And that goes to the cows either in their shelters, or it can go to troughs out in the field when they're not in there. And so with the cows in shelters, it's cut and carry pasture, so it's still pasture fed, still all pasture fed milk, but it's cut and carry, and no brought in fertiliser or feed or anything. Everything in this plan we're able to address that all feed, everything is within the farm. So what we've got is heading towards carbon zero through with all these different products coming off, the greenhouse being heated by the stuff and all these things. We get through to the emissions, and whereas the current ones got nearly 8,400 tonnes of emissions, with our plantings we're down to 6,700, and then with the cows in that shelter we're down to nearly 4,500, but with that final one and they're feeding them the algae and all of these things, we're down to just 2,000. So it's 26%, only 26% of the emissions of the current state. So it's, it's nearly a 75% drop in emissions, which is massive. So when we did this, and the farmers immediately stopped putting the artificial fertiliser on, the nitrates, and they halved their emissions immediately in the first year and increased their profit. So they were pretty happy. As a way forward, I thought it was exciting, and they were really, really excited about it. So you see there these figures, with the plantings down to 80, 53, 26. So our targets for New Zealand were saying, 25% by 2030 and 50% by 2050, 50-50 here. So that by 2050 is the current target. But this could go way further than that, and a lot of people do want to they don't just want to meet the rules, they actually want to do a good job.
Stage 3 would employ a lot more people?
Yes.
Specialised people?
Yes, and these farmers are very interested in people having different products and, having different projects. Yeah, so I think that could be good. Next, right. So, but it involves a lot of planting. That first 20% is a lot of planting. And for a lot of dairy farmers, it's difficult to relinquish arable land to trees. And whilst we've got food trees, there's some that's not food trees, and it can be challenging for people to think about, using trees. So what I thought would show the last farm is one up north of the region, and this is on the Kokura coast and in that very steep country there. We can flick through that. So in the ecological district, we're on that aniseed district there, that really, really steep country there by the sea. And here with the land typing, the coastal hard rock hills, down to the coast. Very high erosion rate sort of country. And at the moment it's reasonably well vegetated. We got the staged images in? Right, so we've got data on this one from the 40s actually. We've got one map from the 40s of the vegetation cover, which was very extensive. And then here's the 60s. You'll see there that's native bush and secondary. And then the pasture's the pale green. And so going through to the 70s, that's when I was working with government, yeah, and see the red bits are slips, and it's, you know, becoming more and more pasture. Next, and there in 93, slightly better, slightly improved. And now in 2020, lots of regen. So what we looked at was what should happen with this land. And here we can see the coverage of those different vegetation.
So this is just the change in vegetation cover through time from the aerial imagery that we had. And so the blue strip is forest, the orange is shrubland, and the yellow is pasture. And this goes from the 1940s to 60s to 70s, and so in this time there was clearance and we've got quite a lot of pasture because there was grazing going on. There were sheep and there were cattle. And that's carried on through for 2 or 3 decades. And then since the 90s, despite trying to maintain it clear, the place regenerates because Kānuka grows really well in that district. And so it wants to turn back into forest. Today, it's already turning back into forest on its own. But the suggestion is that if they took the 60 cattle off the 200 hectares and let it go, it would turn all back to forest. So this is the proposal. And at that stage, it would be sequestering something like 1,000 tonnes per annum of native vegetation.
So if you look at what carbon's worth today, it's what, $38 a tonne at the moment? So that would be an income of $38,000 from that carbon on that block a year without doing anything really. Yeah.
Yeah, at no cost. You just have to shut the gate.
Yeah. And so what we're thinking is that someone on an arable farm might not want to relinquish to woody, but this sort of steep hill country and eroding country, it's good if that's more and more woody. And so perhaps, you know, there's arrangements or whatever that might happen between different sorts of land to encourage that. Yeah.
This is just the hectares of land changed through time, and this is what would happen to the carbon sequestration on that place from today, and then if you took the animals out, it would gradually, the bits of pasture to the left would turn back into forest, and then through time that would increase and then continue for a long time. But the one thing that happens with a benefit of native regeneration and native forest is that it will keep growing for a long time. It will keep growing to become, maturity of native forest takes about 200 or 300 years. And so this would be continuing to sequester carbon for that time. When planted exotics like plantations of pines will stop sequestering carbon after about 16 or 17 years. So they grow fast to start, but they stop because you harvest them. And from then on, they sequester no more carbon. When if you have permanent native forest and you let it go it will go forever, or will go for centuries.
To get into doing a range of things. So whilst our focus on the integrated farm plans is addressing emissions to head to carbon zero, it's working to be complementary to freshwater goals and biodiversity goals and all those other things. And so rather than having this sort of siloed approach, trying to work things together so that we can have integrated management, successfully. Okay, thanks. Any questions?
So these are plans. Are the farmers actually doing it?
Yes. Well, there's.
Can we just repeat the question?
Oh, right. So these are plans. Are the farmers actually doing it? Yeah, good question. Yes, each farm that we've worked on, people have got into gear on some task of change, even so changing the type of pasture to be better, changing the effluent, changing the cow numbers. Yeah, people have got into gear and excited to get some guidance, because that's what we've found. We know there's heaps of stuff against sort of farming and the problem for greenhouse gases, but there was very little guidance to people to what to do. So people are really excited to get a plan, to see what is the situation. Yeah, so that's been lovely, and then you got to plan their way forward. Yes, because some big changes needing to occur. Yeah.
Question. Yeah, just on your forestry thing and the suggestion, nutrient field day about 3 weeks ago, and the guy was saying exactly the opposite. It's exotic versus native, which is from my point of view, it makes it really confusing. It's like Belgium, that's the forestry guy. So, but just getting back to when you talk about food trees, you're talking about human, and plantings, human food, stock food, or both. And then when you talk about nutrients, nutrient goes straight down. So the roots of that tree, how much nutrient are they actually getting? Yeah, well, land area.
The flows on that soil type, we looked at the depths from the soil types there and what we understand that they will intercept. Yes, I haven't got numbers on it, but it was.
Have you got soil types?
Yes. Yes, we've got all that, and what's really good on that dairy farm. We've also got good monitoring of all the emissions and everything, haven't we? There's good monitoring on that, so we've got quite good detailed data right across it. So it's been good. In terms of food plants, quite important. Food plants. Who are they for? So food for people is a priority, but food for poultry and pigs and so on is also important, because they're very interested in those as products. They're growing various poultry and pigs for markets, and yes, can be some food for cattle as well. But so it's both.
And food that's able to be mechanically harvested is sort of...
The people's food, that can be picked and harvested, yes.
Because given the issues around picking food at the moment.
Yes. But by the time we get these trees planted and they get fruiting, hopefully we're into a slightly different era.
I was thinking about the combination of cow poo and walnuts dropping. I mean, that's why you can't use animals to graze in orchards.
Yes.
Not for the whole year, but
it's seasonal though. Yes, seasonal.
And then
yes.
you've got to mow.
Absolutely.
To get an orchard floor
yes.
that you can actually pick up.
And because this is a cut and carry operation primarily, the cows are generally not to be outside, and it's fine to be cut and carry, so that there could be a certain season of grazing, and
so
then
the carbon you're burning to run the machinery that cuts and carries.
That's all produced through the biodigester, so it's all a closed circuit. No biofuel, no fossil fuel stuff. It's all done on a biofuel base.
Does it still produce emissions? still produce something when you're running a machine on
No, I
biofuels.
don't
It's
think
still-
so. No, I think it's just heat or, it's not.
I don't know the technicalities.
Yeah, haven't. The guy in our team who's the expert on that isn't here tonight, sadly. Yeah.
But it is a 24/7 commitment, isn't it?
Yes.
To run the biodigester.
Yes. Yeah. It's fundamental, the biodigester, to the plan. Yeah. Did you? Okay. Oh, sorry, Matt.
So, Di, this is an amazing bit of science, combining your land types at various scales with all of the elements of carbon sequestration. So, is there a separate or related piece of work that looks at how this financially transitions, as people move forward? Because I noticed you said we had $38,000 worth of carbon credits against 60 cows, which is $633.33 per cow per year.
Yeah. That.
How do those things go?
Can I say that land is currently leased for those 60 cows, and the lessee pays $10,000 a year to have his cows there. And so we're saying you get $38,000 for carbon. Yeah.
But and then presumably there's a much more complex matrix for complex farms where you look at moving out of where you are now.
Yes.
And,
Absolutely. Yeah. The finance, well, it was interesting with the dairy farm that they immediately, the changes they made in the first year, that they improved their profit, and that was really good. But our team member, who was a former bank manager, isn't here tonight. And I don't do the numbers. So. Okay. Grant.
I was just thinking, you talked about that Climate Commission report.
Yes.
So and they gave some idea of saying that farmers should maybe start to destock or something at 2%
Yes.
a year for
Yes.
5 years, and then it goes up to 10% or something like that. Is that, presumably if they're going to do that, or they need to do that,
Yes.
then the idea of having some other kind of income from say trees or crops
Yes.
is something they need to be thinking about now.
Yes. Well, with the dairy farm, they reduced the lower production cows, and a lot of farms can do that. They can a bit of culling to get them. But Larry wants to get the device.
Yeah, I think the proposed targets are 10% reduction by 2030, but I think it's 47% reduction by 2050, and that most people can actually attain the 10% reduction just through economies and efficiencies around their current operations. But few people will be able to then continue to make more efficiencies doing what they're doing now, so there will need to be changes.
And that's what these videos show. They're sort of up to 10% reductions from people doing various refinements. So to get further than that, to get towards the 2050, which, I rounded it from 47, I think it is, to 50, but it's easy to remember, 50-50. To head to that, there's going to need to be some big changes on every farm. And that's what I just want better, help people get to understand what some options might be to get there. Yeah. Matt. Oh, sorry.
Any comment on beef and lamb? And they're saying that sheep and beef farmers are already 125%.
Yeah. Larry will comment.
Yeah, that's actually quite a good point, because something that we've done in this exercise is just taking every land use component on a property, and then we've come up with an estimate of what the net emissions are combined between animals, the vegetation and the soils. So there isn't much information around, but we've done the best we can to get an overall estimate of that. And then we've sort of built it up from piece by piece. no matter what that vegetation was. At the moment, there's actually no means of actually registering or actually quantifying those things, because at the moment nobody is responsible for their emissions. No farms have to offset their emissions. So it's all a figment. And now the beef and lamb report is a bit of that as well, is that it includes soil carbon and it includes vegetation. It doesn't actually differentiate very well between sequestration and stocks, which is a key factor. So some of the carbon, a lot of the carbon that has been targeted in that report, and I know the report well because I reviewed it. A lot of the carbon in there isn't actually tradable, so it's real because we've all got soil carbon everywhere.
But that can't be counted.
But it's not something that you would actually trade on.
Can I just say that our speaker next month is from Beef and Lamb New Zealand.
Right.
So it will be
We'll
very
come up then.
interesting to see what he has to say
in
terms of defending that position.
No, but it is true that there is quite a lot of vegetation existing already on beef and lamb, on hill country farms.
Yeah.
But we don't know what sort of state it's in, how much it is actually growing, sequestering carbon, or how much of it is mature and stable.
So explaining that stocks versus sequestering is really important. So there's an old tree, might have a whole lot of carbon, but it doesn't mean it's sequestering, so it's not mitigating the emissions. So it can't be counted.
Going back to what Larry said about a native tree maturing at 300 years, if you went into the forest and found a 1,000-year-old totara, beautiful, and you get the impression that it has a lot of carbon, and it does, but at 300 years, that's just holding that carbon, that's not sequestering.
So it can't be counted.
It changes and holds it.
And the same with, not the same, but also with soil carbon, you briefly mentioned, because that's talked about a lot, and beef and lamb factored that in, and that can't be counted because it's very vulnerable.
It's actually also impossible to measure the changes that are going on in it at the rate that they're happening.
So you hear a lot, like from Regen Ag and people, about soil carbon, but that can't be counted as mitigation in this. So people need to be aware of that. Yeah.
You mentioned early on in this process that planting trees for the first 20% was going to give you quite a good system. The mix of pasture and trees, and depending on the timber value of those trees, have you done much work on that in terms of how that works? Say on an existing, private farm or.
Yeah. Do you want to repeat the question, please?
Sorry, the question is: have we looked at the value of the timber and trees?
Yeah, just the ideas that you've come up with for combination, which is like a traditional farm forest and stuff, where you have grazed pasture, but with trees as well. And have you looked at the different types of trees that might give a better
better in that. It's a little bit to do with the difference between pine trees and slower growing natives, is whether or not you have fast growing exotics or slow growing exotics. And mostly if you have fast growing things, they get you quicker to the point when they're not actually sequestering anything more. Because all tree growth is finite. So trees grow steadily and then with age they slow. And they might keep growing for a long time, but they don't actually sequester any more carbon. They don't get any bigger. Every dead branch offsets the little bit of growth that happens. And so that's why mature forest is close to being equilibrium. It's close to being neutral. It's a huge stock, but but it's insignificant sequestration. So this is why all forests or all trees are actually only a finite solution to climate change. And the faster they grow, the quicker you get to the time when they're not any use anymore. So
a combination then of a fast-growing tree with an understory of permanent forest, and
So-
you manage that going forward.
yeah.
That's-
It might be a quick architect.
So
Yeah. That's an option, yes.
yeah, so I think it's a really interesting dilemma for us, is whether or not we plant things that grow fast, or whether which assumes that climate change is going to be solved by 2050.
See these...
Or do you think about something that's sustainable and is long term? And that will always be slower. It will be slower growing, but it will keep going for a longer time. And so that's the trade-off.
Because these pines that are being planted now, they're going to be all logged and gone by 2050, and toilet
Yeah.
paper in India by then. They're gone. There's no carbon. Yeah.
It doesn't argue you just have 30-year cycles or 300-year cycles, and the net effect is the same. Is that
No, because the 30-year cycle means that you get to the harvest, you chop it down, the product is re-emitted to the atmosphere. At the moment, the average half-life of pine timber in New Zealand is 6.5 years.
It's exported.
Because 80 or 90% of it is exported, and the products that it goes into are framing boxing or
Packaging
or pulp or paper, and so
within
that's-
4 years they're generally gone. It's
depends on the product, what its life is, and most of the life of most of those products is actually really short. The proportion that goes into long-term uses is small. It's like 3% or something of the total cut. So what happens is, as soon as you cut it down and you've lost it off this hectare of land on your property, so it's gone down the road, but it's still in New Zealand. But then it goes through a factory and it turns into something else, or it goes into a log and goes onto a ship, and it's lost to New Zealand. Now, there's a question about whether or not New Zealand is accounting for that loss. What's the important thing is that it's then in the globe, and we need to be thinking about the atmospheric effect. It's actually the global atmosphere that is the ultimate measure, and that's where we should be sort of thinking about where these things go. And that depends on the products that it's turned into and their life. And that work hasn't been done. We don't know what the life cycle analysis of carbon that's derived from New Zealand forest products is. We know what part of it is, because people have looked at some parts of it, but we don't know what the overall. When back here, you've still got, if you've planted a long-lived native forest, it's still living, it's still growing, slowly, but going on for a long, long time.
sequestering, yeah.
So this might be a really stupid question.
No, there's no stupid questions in this. No.
Any point at all then in planting fast growing stuff? Like that's going to be harvested. Like in terms of the climate change, you're just slightly postponing the inevitable.
There's views out there that say we shouldn't be planting any trees. There shouldn't be trying to offset anything. We should be looking at emissions reductions, because in the end that's the best solution. That offsetting by any means is just putting off the inevitable.
But
some of us like to have trees around.
yeah, and we talk about it in the farm plans as insetting. So it's about the
We've
emissions,
distracted off farm plans.
emissions on a farm that we can sequester, so that we can sequester the equivalent as an inset on that property.
Yeah.
That's what we
And
think.
even responding a little bit to the beef and lamb numbers, we sort of tore them down a bit, but one thing that we found that pumps up farmers' numbers a little bit is that when we do the accounting, these sort of maps on a farm, we found that the way that people are calculating GHG on farms at the moment, you'd look at a paddock and it just covers over everything around it and categorises that as paddock. And the way that we look at the landscape, say for this farm, I found that 10% of it was shelter belts. And that accounts for like a huge amount, well not huge, but a significant chunk, it's like a good slice of the pie, is shelter belts. So we found that when we were like going down into the detail and accounting for actually what's truly on the farm,
Not just what obviously you recognise.
not what is called productive land, and unproductive land, and sort of ignoring what they call unproductive, and having this treatment of retiring land, but looking at the full picture of your whole property as productive in some sense.
Yeah, yeah.
When you're measuring, they're using satellites for so many things now.
Yes.
Including measuring pasture, and so why can't they just
Yeah, well,
all these?
it's interesting that we found a 10% error spatially, and 10%'s a lot, yeah.
Yeah, that's again a good question, and people are working on as many remote systems as they can to answer as many questions as they can. But it's
The aerial imagery, like if you look at the land cover database, that's based on aerial imagery and automatically works it out. But if you go onto your property, you'll find out it miscategorises based on aerial imagery. It's not quite video.
So what we've proposed, and I don't know if anyone's looked, if you look on our integrated farm plan website, did you put down to that? Is it on the footer, Leona? There's a paper there we did at Massey a year or so ago on the integrated farm plan.nz, if you look on that side. And we've proposed, we would like to do, is to make a DIY tool so that farmers can go online and make their own indicative farm plan of how to get to carbon zero, because the farmers know the nuances and the rough bits and all the bits. And rather than someone just off a satellite or in town going out and having to, try and map it inadequately, the farmers know the bits that can be used in other ways, that have limitations now for production or have other opportunities. And we've worked out, Steph's leading this, a way to develop a DIY tool so that every farmer of all these 40,000 farmers that need to do carbon management plans, they can go online and make their plan. And so that's what we're seeking to do at the moment, because we think it's impractical any other way, really. There's very few people that know. It's complex stuff. And to get people to be able to do this, it'd be best if it was at least an indicative plan, to get some idea what's going to be involved, what might be involved, how big a change might I have to do as a farmer. What are my emissions and where am I going? So that's our current proposal. But Matt's got a question.
Yes, just one clarification. You were talking about how the carbon step down under the last example you were showing for 75%, but then you also quoted an example that said by stopping the nitrate in the first year you'd save 50%?
Yeah, there's 50% reduction in emissions in that,
so
wasn't there? Nitrates.
That's a huge
Nitrates.
Even over the managed
Yeah.
change that you were talking about. Right.
Yeah.
So that is correct.
Mm.
Yeah.
In the nitrates, yes.
And then the other question was, So why under regenerative or just really good biological health of soils, is that not a more effective way of sequestering carbon?
It's promissory, I would say.
The question.
The question was whether or not regenerative agriculture does improve soil carbon. It may do, but nobody's actually measured it. Although, just in the last day, I've seen a report that's just come out from Pamu. Did you see that?
Oh, no.
So people want to know the answer to that, whether or not it's true, because it appears as if it should be. But there hasn't been information, and there is indications coming out just now that there is some benefits.
However,
The thing about soil carbon is it normally just changes slowly. It doesn't change in big steps. It doesn't even change as fast as plants grow. Because it's sort of a feedback. The way that soil carbon alters, it's quite complex. And there are
but it's only going to
indications
be
that it is
part of a
positive,
package.
and we hope it is, and maybe it'll be.
But then the vulnerability in terms of drought and so on is an issue there. Yeah. Anyway. Another question at the back here.
One of the anomalies in carbon accounting is that wetlands are not included in it, and they sequester carbon at a far faster rate than any forest. Have we got some progress towards changing that situation?
Yeah, for a start, what you've just said is questionable. So what happens is that wetlands vary widely. Wetlands vary from the ephemeral bit of bog out on the middle of a paddock through to a swamp forest with deep peat. Globally, people have been trying to measure carbon sequestration over wetlands of various sorts for a long time. And the overall average is that they may be a little bit, they may be sequestering a little bit, or they may be losing a little bit. And the trick is that if they're growing peat, they could be growing some carbon, but at the same time they're releasing swamp gas. Swamp gas is methane. Methane is 23 or 24 times more of a greenhouse gas than CO2 is. Yeah. But they also release some nitrogen oxides, which are 200 times more. So it's not as simple as just accumulating peat. You actually have to do the gas exchange over it. So in New Zealand, the only measures that have gone on that looked at wetland sequestration are from the Waikato, and they show that there is about 2 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per hectare per annum that they are sequestering. But they are the only swamplands, and these are peat swamplands. These are the only places that have been measured in New Zealand. Nobody knows what the emissions or sinks are, or sequestration is, around restored wetlands that people are actually building. There may be some, but most people plant herbaceous things around them. If we planted a swamp forest and got some kakatias going and some big trees, then I think there probably will be some carbon. But again, nobody actually knows what that is. So I think your question is valid, that we need to know a lot more, but the work hasn't been done yet to people have been trying to clarify it, but there isn't an overall blanket solution to it. And so it's a bit like the mature forest state, is that there's a huge stock of carbon. It's really critical that they remain, that they're not cleared, because there's so much carbon sunk in them. In fact, swamp wetland carbon per unit area on the globe is much greater than probably the forests or soil carbon. So they're really critical, really important, but they don't, like soil carbon, they don't change very much very fast, and some of them are and some of them aren't. So it's always slightly more complicated than what what we always hope.
The
Okay.
international studies would indicate very high degree of sequestration. As far as
Some are, but some don't.
And then there's the
the
gases.
agent's been used here,
Yeah,
and they say marshlands,
yeah,
mineral soils
Yeah.
are going to be emitters.
yeah.
But we don't have that many of those. We actually do, we
Oh.
don't have much left anyway.
No, that's right.
But what we have is mainly swamp,
Yeah,
and it's mainly a carbon building system. But I just raised the point.
Yes.
I think I just still,
Tricky.
I still believe it's an anomaly that needs addressing.
yeah.
We haven't counted because we think, they're not.
We've
yet
treated
able
them
to
as
be.
being neutral because, yeah. Although if we were on the Waikato Plains, then maybe we'd include them as a small game.
But if you have trees in the woody, you can, yeah.
I was just going to say maybe you could give that little note about that 700 year, 600 year re-wetting, just to show the pace that they change or don't.
Yeah, so one wetland story I can tell is I was at a conference and there was a wetland scientist from Finland there, and he described what Finland has got a lot of peat and a lot of wetlands, and they had drained wetlands to plant forests. So they'd dug huge big drains, drained out the wetlands to dry it out a bit so that they could get trees to grow on it. And at the same time they were measuring the peat resources on those dried, previously wet but now drying lands. They planted their trees, and what they found was that the gain from the trees didn't make up for the losses from the decaying peat, from the
Carbon.
the peat was just breaking down and expiring. So what they did then was that they stopped the drains and reflooded the wetlands. And from what they could tell, it was going to take something like 700 years for the wetlands to stop losing carbon and then to turn the corner and come back up again. Things don't happen quickly in these systems.
So talking long time frames.
Yeah.